As everyone is getting settled, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Continue eating, and we're going to move forward with the agenda tonight. Again, thank you. I want to start out by thanking a few people that are in attendance tonight. Our new city manager, Mr. Washington. I saw Mr. DeLong. There he is. He's here also. Some of our elected officials, Commissioner Ruth Kelly, she's over there. Commissioner Kurt Reppert in the back there. Commissioner Sunita Lanier. Commissioner Nathaniel Moody. And our Mayor, Rosalind Bless. She's over here. Also, Chris Becker from the prosecutor's office. I believe I saw him come in the back there. Boy, is there any other elected officials? I'm sorry if I missed you. I think we got them all. Okay. Well, again, thanks for coming here tonight. This is our final meeting of the task force. I think over a year long, there's been a lot of robust conversation about it, and I will say I'm proud with the work that we accomplished. Is there still work to be done? Absolutely, and we're going to continue with that work. But during tonight's program, we're going to talk about some of the things that we did, some of the recommendations that came from the task force. And I should have mentioned the people from 21st Century CP that have been here with us every step of the way. Jim Koppel, who will be our facilitator tonight. Most important, Colleen Koppel, who has kept us in order. And then Ron Davis. He's one of the principals of 21st CP. He's running in right now. He must have to take a phone call. But you'll hear from him later on tonight. And I think with that, we'll turn over to my co-chair. I should introduce myself for those that do not know. I'm Eric Payne. I'm Deputy Chief of Police for the Police Department, and I'm one of the co-chairs for 21st for the task force.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. As Eric said, my name is Raynard Ross. I'm one of the co-chairs for this task force as well, and just want to welcome you here. And also really wanted to take a moment this afternoon as I look forward to really what is somewhat of a, it may seem like a stretch to say a momentous occasion, but in this great city, I think this is a momentous occasion. Been quite a few reflections I've had over the past year with this work, and fortunately, I've been married long enough to understand I should write them down as opposed to coming off the cuff. So I really just want to really start off by thanking a few folks. I'm going to ask the community folks on the task force in particular to stand up right now, if you would, just so everyone in the room knows who you are. And it's important, you'll have these folks at your table doing the table exercise tonight. These people are going to help out in that regard. But for this particular group in particular, though, I really just want to thank you for the volunteer time you've put into this. We know it's been hours and hours and weeks and months of research and review of GRPD policy-related materials. We all know this has been a laborious work, but essential work that has helped us as a community to what I believe to be a precipice of change in regards to police and community relations here in Grand Rapids. I do personally believe that with continued efforts, we will become a model for urban cities in America who want more collaborative efforts in regards to how its communities are policed. And to my community colleagues for the sacrifice you made over the past year, I do want to personally thank you and acknowledge your not just your commitment and your time, but also your intelligence and your passion, your wherewithal for what sometimes it seemed like a thankless job. So thank you very much to that part of the task force. Thank you, sir. But also, I do want to thank the servicemen and women on this task force. So if you could stand as well, please. And I thank you for indulging me with this. To you, with whom we as community members were shoulder to shoulder with while unpacking and critically examining the policies and practices of the department, your jobs are not enviable. It's too often one that's thankless and filled with countless others looking at things in hindsight and saying to you what you should have done or should not have done. For your commitment, your service, and your perseverance, I do also want to genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, say thank you. It has really been an honor and a pleasure to participate with you in this important work, and I do commend you. And thank you. But of course, I also want to say thank you to our city leadership. Welcome to our new city manager, and those in our community who have demonstrated a genuine sense of care and concern about increasing trust and accountability for our GRPD. To those of you who are here tonight, and to those who have participated in previous meetings or simply stayed abreast via news stories, social media, and/or the proverbial barbershop talk, thank you for caring. Your voice is needed if we are to continue to have a positive impact on the relationship that GRPD has with the various subsets of our community. To that end, I'd like to also ask that, along with the accountability that we are placing on the men and women within GRPD, that we also hold ourselves accountable as a community, hold our friends accountable, our neighbors accountable, to be more active partners in this long-term relationship building process. Relationship building is not a one-way street. There can never be one entity within the relationship that's always wrong or always right. This is truly a collaborative effort if we truly want the time that we're all spending here tonight and moving forward to be valuable. So please, let's just keep that in mind. But lastly, I think it should be noted that this task force was charged with reviewing policies and procedures of the Grand Rapids Police Department in relation to racialized outcomes for communities of color in Grand Rapids. What we found through this process is the opportunity to make changes to many policies and procedures that will undoubtedly have a positive effect on the aforementioned goal of the task force. However, I'm hopefully speaking for every member of this team, both sworn and otherwise, that our work has not gone far enough. Due to the scope of the charge that was put before the task force, we frankly were not able to go deep enough into the various systematic, institutionalized, and cultural factors that do impact how we police and serve all persons in our community in a manner that is both equitable and effective. As such, in addition to the recommendations that are before you tonight, I and others on the task force do also recommend that the City of Grand Rapids commit to the progress made here regarding police-community relations and use it as a foundation for continued efforts to address the deeper challenges of which most everyone in this room is aware. Of course, this will not be simple as it includes police practices and culture that account for the intersectionality of safety and crime prevention in a manner that accounts for the deep concerns around poverty, racism, community mental health, economic development, and historically disenfranchised segments of the American landscape. If we do approach this with intentionality and an inclusive process that, along with the department, is jointly owned by concerned citizens and city leaders, we will prosper in relation to the joint goals that have brought us here tonight. Unfortunately, I don't have the complete clarity of thought in regards to this, nor is it my role to solely identify such, but I do humbly ask that these efforts be given the widespread commitment that they do deserve. I want to thank you all for your time tonight and for your future efforts and commitment to this great work. And with that, we're going to move forward. But keep in mind, too, as we move forward with these recommendations, at this juncture, the background or the next steps of this work, that's not necessary for us tonight. We really want to make sure everyone is aware of the work that the task force has done, and you'll have an opportunity to weigh in on those recommendations to help us identify where the low-hanging fruit or the most immediate objectives might be. Thank you. Oh, how can I forget? Go ahead. I was just going to say, how can I forget to introduce our wonderful mayor?
Yeah.
But no.
Well, real quick also, I want to also thank Assistant Superintendent Larry Johnson for hosting us here tonight, providing this facility for us. But one person we haven't mentioned who brought us all together in the first place is our city attorney, Anita Hitchcock. So thank you.
And so no further ado, welcome our great mayor to the great city of Grand Rapids, Rosalind Bliss, for some opening remarks.
Thank you, and I'm going to add my thanks to both Deputy Chief Payne and Renard Ross for co-chairing this important work, so thank you both. I know you've put a lot of energy into this. And I'm just going to say a few words of welcome. On behalf of the entire City Commission, my colleagues who are here tonight, we want to thank you all for coming out to our fourth meeting hosted by our task force. So tonight we'll hear an update on the task force work, the recommendations, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about next steps. One elected official that was not recognized that I want to recognize because I have a ton of respect for him and the work that he does in our community, and that is Judge Eckert. So, Judge, thanks for being here tonight. So it's been nearly 18 months since the City Commission came together and approved the creation of this task force. And then shortly after that, we moved forward with the team from 21st Century Policing to assist us in this critical work. So thank you for all of your work as well. So members of the task force and our police department have given a significant amount of time and energy to this work. And I want to add my sincere thank you to each of them. This work has not been easy. It's required a lot of listening and learning and many difficult conversations. So I'm incredibly grateful for the willingness and the commitment of every member of the task force and our police department. This is critically important work as we strive to come together to eliminate disparate outcomes and to strengthen community relations. And as Reynard said, that's a journey. It takes a lot of time to build trust. We know that, but how we're going to get there is we're going to get there together. So this work is really one step in a much longer journey, and we know that there's still a lot to do. And we also know it requires every single one of us. So I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I know there are a lot of places you could be. And I also want to thank you for your commitment and dedication to our community and your commitment to being a part of the solution. So thank you so much.
At this time, we'd like to bring up Mr. James Koppel, the primary facilitator for this work, who's going to lead us through the next steps of tonight's agenda.
It's great to see so many of you here. This has been a great process for 21CP, working with you and facilitating this task force. There was a commitment to get the job done, to be candid, to look very openly at issues, gaps, and to really address issues that go to disparate policing. We work in a number of communities and a number of cities around the country. And Grand Rapids has a great police department. You're a great community. And I've appreciated in the community meetings the number of people that have showed up. I often talk about community collaboration. It's what happens at any given football game in America. You have 22 people out on the field who need rest being watched by 22,000 people who need exercise. And getting citizens engaged and involved is a critical and important part of this process. And goes to civilian oversight, it goes to accountability, it goes to community, at the heart of community policing. We've had a number of meetings. We've been meeting since last September, and we've had this is our fourth community meeting. Those meetings have been 4 hours at least, once a month. We've reviewed policies and procedures. The department has been extremely helpful in providing policies and procedures related to disparate or bias-based policing. That was our narrow charge. A lot of us wanted to solve a lot of other problems or a lot of issues, but we were assigned to specifically focus. And the discipline that the task force kept to look at those issues was extremely helpful, and it allowed us to move forward and to really come up with 38 recommendations that we believe will enhance and improve already a superior police department, and will be more transparent in its relationship to the community and should address some of these issues. Will it solve all the problems? No, but it will certainly give us a vehicle or a platform for moving forward in some of the other issues that Reynard has identified. And so the process, as I said, was 12 months. And we're going to write up a final report, which will include a complete narrative of all the minutes, all the research, all the pieces that came together to help form the work of the task force, and so that we have a good historical record. I will tell you that as we had a task force meeting before this, that I was in a meeting several weeks ago with the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training. They are the people that oversee all the 650 training academies and the 50 posts that oversee certification of law enforcement officers in this country. They're adopting and looking at your youth policy and your task force recommendations as a way in which to influence training in this country. So you're having an impact already in terms, and have set a template and a model for real transformation. And you should be proud of what your city has done, what your community has done. I know when you're inside the bubble and you're looking at it, you may not think it's so great. I'm telling you, as an outsider who works in numerous communities, you're doing a great job, and you should celebrate that as a community in terms of what your police force is doing. And you know, when there's challenges or mistakes, there's a willingness to address the mistakes and to move forward. And so the process was very open. People had the participants, the citizens who participated, the law enforcement agencies. There were some interesting discussions, which made facilitation really interesting. But we got through it, and we came up with some recommendations that I think that you're going to be proud of. What we're going to do tonight is Reynard and Deputy Chief Payne is going to review the highlights of the recommendations. Then Ron Davis from 21CP will come up and review the assessment that was done on how the Grand Rapids Police Department is doing in light of the task force, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which Ron was the executive director of that task force, and I helped facilitate that task force done by President Obama. The 6 pillars, Ron will review how the department is lined up with those 6 pillars, and particularly as it's evolved over the last 6 months. We will then have a table exercise. We want to hear from you what you think are the top priorities that we should address. You have the recommendations on your table. We hope you've had a chance to review them. We know they've been in the paper and they've been widely disseminated, and that you will be somewhat familiar with them. But we want to hear from you what you think as a table should be the top 5 things that we do going forward. And then we want to get brainstorm for a few moments, ways in which you think the community can better engage with the Grand Rapids Police Department and get some of your ideas. That's very important to this process. I know it's important to the new city manager, who you'll be hearing from later tonight. He wants to know what your priorities are as the city begins to set the priorities of the 38 recommendations. And we'll have closing remarks from the chief, and then again, your new city manager, Washington, will talk about some next steps. So at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Reynard and to Eric, and they will review the recommendations. Thank you.
As Mr. Koppel mentioned, you should have a copy of all the recommendations in front of you, the 38. We're not going to go through each and every one of them. We're going to pick out a few highlights that are part of the recommendations and kind of briefly go over them. But starting with staffing and deployment, GRPD should conduct a comprehensive staffing and deployment analysis, including but not limited to the evaluation of current beat configuration and assessment of current and future staffing needs, both sworn and civilian, of the department based on service demands and comprehensive adoption of community policing. Again, we're not going to go into details of it. At a later date, I believe we're going to be able to comment on each of them, but at this point, we're just mentioning what some of the highlighted recommendations are from each of the areas that we looked at.
As it was mentioned, you obviously had the opportunity to breeze through these briefly, so again, we're not going to read them all to you particularly, but in regards to area number 2, internal affairs, I would like to point out a few things. In recommendation 2.1, you can see that GRPD should add clear prohibitions against conflict of interest to the existing internal affairs policies. And what that is that there has been language change to that policy to ensure that, or hopefully to reduce potential bias in internal affairs investigations. Obviously, many folks in the department know one another well. There may even be people who may be related to one another. So the task force just thought it was important to institute some policy that would prohibit folks from investigating one another when there's a close relationship, be it a familial or friendship or business context, whatever the case may be. So that is one of the recommendations, one of the changes that actually is already underway. In regards to launching internal affairs investigations and complaints from community members, when we look at recommendations 2.2 and 2.3, there's some similarity there in that it enables the on-duty supervisor to receive those complaints. Prior to this, those complaints were fielded during traditional business hours, and as we know, life goes on, and life sometimes occurs at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday night. So to have citizens be relegated to offering such complaints during typical business hours, well, we just didn't think it was particularly prudent. So on-duty supervisors, regardless of time of day or night, now are empowered to, or actually are, I shouldn't say mandated, but the policy will have the expectation that the on-duty supervisor field those complaints and disseminate them appropriately regardless of the time of day or night. I'm going to move ahead to 2.5, where we talk about an analysis of community complaints for the past 5 years to identify patterns and trends. I think that sort of speaks for itself, but I think it deserves to be highlighted because it does indicate the willingness that our department has to look in the mirror, per se, and to look at past practice to hopefully inform future practice. So if there are any patterns in regards to complaints that clearly identify a concern, that enables the department and the city to plan to rectify those appropriately. And then 2.6, regarding a summary report on an annual basis that provides a comprehensive report and analysis of the aggregate data on complaint patterns and trends, similar to 2.5, just empowering our department to really have a firm picture and where it stands in regards to any particular complaint area. And then lastly, 2.7 speaks to the early intervention system to include stop and search data. And what that is, that gives the department an opportunity to analyze each individual officer's behaviors, I suppose is the best way to put it, to see if there is a pattern of complaints, particularly of a particular type, particularly those that may contribute to disparate outcomes. So that earlier intervention system will enable the department to monitor individual officer behavior on I guess, a clearer basis. So that is it for the Internal Affairs Section 2 recommendations and training. Deputy Chief Payne.
Under training, if you look at 3.1, GRPD should conduct an annual training needs assessment to identify continual professional training courses that include consideration of information and lessons learned from community complaints, feedback, stop and search data analysis, use of force, and assaults against officers. This is something that will provide information to the community about training. And I should back up. The task force thought it was very important to look at many different areas, but training and internal affairs was one that we spent considerable amount of time on, but as it turned out, there weren't many recommendations coming out of those. But I'll move on to 3.3. GRPD should, in partnership with the community, develop and provide training on cultural competency with focus on communities that have been historically disenfranchised by law enforcement and typically have generated mistrust with the police. These groups include, but are not limited to, immigrants, LGBTQ, and communities of color. The task force felt it was very important to look into that area and make sure that the department's looking at a cultural competency for all officers in that area.
And now I want to jokingly say the moment you've all been waiting for, the youth policy. That was an attempt at humor.
Well, by the way, it just happened to fall that way, so I'll let him take it.
But no, in all seriousness, we do know this has probably been the largest area of attention as far as the task force work is concerned. But I guess I should clarify really that the step to move in this direction was something that that Chief Rahinsky and the leadership team of GRPD made steps for even absence of the input of the task force. Now, obviously, the task force was integral in the vetting of the policy, as were many other groups in our community, youth groups in particular, pastoral groups, and other, citizen leaders throughout the community did have a chance to lay eyes on this. But in all honesty, this was almost a, these are my words only, almost a no-win situation in that I don't think there's a single person in this room who likes the sight of a child being handcuffed, even when there is, for lack of a phrase, good procedural reason to conduct that handcuffing. So I don't think anyone necessarily likes that, but there are certain realities in which that is sometimes required. And the purpose of the policy was to provide some framework and give officers a greater sense of boots on the ground discretion, if you would, to determine when it may or may not be best and appropriate. By no means was it an effort to prevent an officer from being able to handcuff a child, because I think at the end of the day, every situation is different. Some situations may call for it, some do not. But I think the good news behind this conversation is that this community has mobilized around this issue. I think the good news behind this is that the men and women in blue have also mobilized and recognized that there is potential to do something differently in regards to how we engage with our youth. So although the first iteration of this policy is not obviously the final iteration of this policy, it definitely was a step in the right direction. And frankly, I would, and again, these are my words only, I would really challenge anyone in this community to say that that work was fruitless. Again, it may not be the final iteration, but everything starts with some sort of beginning. And I think this has definitely been a beginning to something that is going to be impactful, not just for the young people in Grand Rapids, but for all of us in the city of Grand Rapids. And I do think we all, and I will say, our task force deserves a round of applause for that, and I will give that to them myself. But that being said, some of the particulars in regards to the current version of the youth policy that I'd like to point out, I'm going to jump ahead to 4.2 that talks about the prohibiting the handcuffing of a child under the age of 12 unless exigent circumstances are present, such as violent behavior, possession of a firearm, et cetera, et cetera. It's important for officers to determine context and situation in which they handcuff a child or a youth. I suspect that the spirit behind 4.2 will be consistent with whatever iteration we have of this policy. But again, I just want to point out the fact that during the task force deliberation about this policy, there was some deep interest and some deep research to identify what may be an appropriate age. There is really no benchmark per se. If you look along the national landscape of police agencies, of the approximately 16,000 agencies in the nation, less than 5% of those agencies even have any form of youth policy. So again, this is a revolutionary step that we've taken here, and I just again want to reiterate that it's a step in the right direction. And I think that, again, with the continued involvement and the continued collaborative effort between police and community, that this will be a policy that we can all hang our hat on moving forward. So again, thank you for your support and involvement in that. But again, 4.3, the policy should require supervisors to respond to the scene whenever a minor 12 or under is handcuffed. And again, that just speaks to accountability. By no means do I think our department is filled with any sort of rogue element, but obviously all of us in our jobs, we understand that we all have supervisors for a reason. The expectation that those people have a certain degree of wisdom, a certain degree of insight, and a certain raised ability to ensure that outcomes are what are hoped for. So again, that policy does require that a supervisor be brought to the scene if a child is handcuffed. And again, I won't read through them all, but those particular highlights I imagine will be consistent as we edit this and change this. So yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Under 5, community policing and crime reduction. If you go to 5.1, recognizing that community policing works best when it is supported by elected leaders and is a subset of community-based governance. The mayor and city commission should adopt a resolution that mandates community policing as the operating philosophy of the police department and require all city departments to contribute to enhance public safety through community collaborations. I don't want to backtrack, but if you go to 1.1, again, the first one I read about the staffing and deployment study, I think it's very important that those things are incorporated and looked at, and once that study is completed, and I think we're looking at somewhere around March, maybe it being completed, maybe that will allow us and give us better direction in being able to enhance some of the community policing efforts that we would like to initiate. 5.2 GRPD should develop a citywide community policing plan that incorporates crime reduction strategies, community engagement and partnerships, and police department oversight. The task force felt it was very important to have the community engaged, and I think you're going to hear from Mr. Davis speak on the oversight. What that looks like is yet to be determined, and I believe Mr. Washington will speak on that also. So again, what we've done so far is I think a huge step, but we must continue working toward making this a better community. If you look at 5.3, GRPD should include community members in its COMSTAT process. There's another term, COMSTAT, that maybe the majority of you are not aware of, but basically it's holding commanders accountable for the area that they supervise, also their officers. At some point, we're going to bring in community members, and we're still developing that process, but COMSTAT gives officers direction on what they should be doing day in, day out when they go out there. And again, getting feedback from the community will be incorporated with that. We've launched, you may have seen the Elucid program that we launched on getting the sentiment of the community. We're still working toward that. All those things will be incorporated at some point in the COMSTAT process along with community members.
And finally, the recommendation area 6, recruiting and hiring. There are just 4 there. I think the biggest is 6.1, where the city and GRPD continuous recruitment outreach efforts with a specific focus on minority recruitment and retention. And obviously, as we examine a policy and procedures, there are a lot of things on that can be changed on paper that have an impact on disparate outcomes. However, there is also a reality that the particular men and women that don that uniform also have an impact on disparate outcomes. And it's the belief of the task force, and I think this is an issue across the country, the challenge in finding qualified men and women of color to don the uniform, to go out and provide service to this community, and that is going to be a priority for GRPD and the city of Grand Rapids. And from a community perspective, though, I think we all have a bit of maybe a responsibility to change the narrative, if you would, to make it more of a viable option for the young people in our homes and our neighborhoods to see this profession as one that is a calling, one that is service-oriented, and one that, frankly, can have impact from the inside out, if you would. If all of us as black and brown people run from the profession, then I think we will be challenged to see the level of change that we all may want to see. So I think we all also have a responsibility to, again, promote the opportunities that are prevalent within the field of law enforcement. It can't simply be the task of departments to go out and find folks. You can only sometimes find folks who want to be found. So I think we all have a role in that regard. So again, that does close out the brief overview of our recommendations. I would implore all of you to take the time to go online and to read them further. Take the copy you have home with you. Talk about it with your sons, daughters, husbands, wives, aunts, uncles, whatever the case may be, and really commit yourself to being a part of this effort moving forward. Again, it's going to be led by the city and the police department, but it's the community of all of us here. It's not simply the city's responsibility to make progress in this regard. So, but thank you very much for your time in that. And next we will have Mr. Davis come and speak objectively about some of the assessment efforts and professional perspective from 21 CPD as far as the great department that we do have.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. So before I get into that part of assessment, if I can, just for a moment, I want to tie a couple of loose knots with the recommendations, because in In the sense of time, we highlighted a couple key ones. But I think the outstanding part of the recommendations that the task force did is they're very much linked. And so go back to the task that we were given, which was to take a look at the policies and the practices of the department that could contribute to the racial disparities that were identified in the Lambert report. So one, we make sure that that mission is not the same thing as a top-to-bottom review of the department. It was not a managerial assessment. It was, are there policies that could be contributed to those findings of racial disparities? A question that's being asked all over this country every day. And so I applaud the city for tackling that issue the way that it has. And so when you look at those recommendations, keep that question in mind, and then look at how it follows. So for example, we've had this conversation, I think, along the way in the meetings. The first set of recommendations are important because why you deploy and how you deploy contributes greatly to whether or not you're going to have racial disparities. And if you think about it, and from a common sense point of view, what I mean common sense is you don't have to be a cop to figure this out, is if you're putting a lot of cops in certain areas and they're doing a lot of enforcement activities, then by the nature of it, before you even talk about bias, race, you're going to have a disparate outcomes. There's no other outcome that could occur. So the question has to be is, why do you deploy this way? How do you deploy? And if you're sending officers into an area which, because it's suffering from crime and violence, what actions do you have the officers engaged in? And a couple of the recommendations talk about making sure officers have more non-enforcement engagement. So communities that require more services, that services does not always have to be a hammer. Because you know the phrase, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So that's why the first series of recommendations is important. When we get to internal affairs, it sounds internal, but if you look at racial bias, if there's no accountability in the department, complaints are not received, especially complaints about bias, then officers can operate with impunity. So we want to take a look at the system to make sure that it's open to you, to a community member, that there's no barriers. So those ones are designed to make sure that anytime, day or night, if you have a concern at your stop, that you don't have to wait till the next business day, as Renee talked about, that you have an access to be able to do that. And we found a department that was very open and a very progressive complaint process. That's what the important was with there. With training, it's very important because training also ties into the area that you're dealing with right now with youth. Right, there's classes on everything from implicit bias, understanding the teen brain, understanding that kids' minds develop different when they're kids than adults. And that what could be youthful exuberance to them could be seen as resistance to a police officer, making sure the officer understands that so that a 16-year-old is not treated as a 25-year-old, right? Or a 12-year-old is not perceived to be a 25-year-old. So that's why the training part is very important. As we found with the recommendations is the more the community is involved in those processes, as you know, the recommendations, the more the issues of implicit bias can be dealt with from an academic point of view, but from an actual practical point of view. So when you look at Series 3, it's very important that you understand how that ties to 1 and 2. With 4, it goes to not just now how you deploy, but why. What is community policing and crime reduction really about? And for the departments that engage with the deployment, we call it hotspot policing, where you're putting cops on the dots, but you're not engaged in evidence-based practices, then what you end up doing is over-policing communities of color, right? You end up having pockets of the city where you can't walk without being stopped, you can't drive without being stopped, because the deployment pattern is putting all these cops in there, not doing anything other than enforcing different laws. And if anyone ever seen a vehicle code for any state in this country, you give me a vehicle code and any car that one of you driving, and I guarantee you I'll find a legal reason to stop you within about 10 seconds. So it's not as simple as just compliance or obey the law, right? This is about why are you there, so that all the Section 4 is about making sure the city is embracing community policing philosophy beyond a meeting, beyond a program, beyond coffee with a cop, that it's in every aspect of the operations, that you're a part of the training, that you're developing the training, that you are notified when there's going to be enforcement activities, that you get to weigh in on the quality and the manner in which policing occurs in your area. So when you look at those recommendations, they're designed to do that because that can start minimizing, again, the racial disparities. And then with Area 5, I think we looked at was, I skipped one, but that was Area 5. And with 6, a diverse workforce does make for a better and more formed and more responsive department. And I think we told you in the community meeting at the time is we saw a city, because the city plays a significant role in recruitment and hiring for the police department. It was a great partnership. You guys are doing a lot of progressive things, youth academies, trying to grow your own, outreach. So we had very little recommendations other than please keep doing what you're doing, right? You got some regional challenges, you got some state challenges, and maybe to the extent, depending on your staffing analysis, if you decide to hire, think about maybe opening up that net a little bit nationally so that you can recruit the best and the brightest to come. there is no shortage of qualified, young, black men and women that would want to serve this community. And people sometimes make the false choice that somehow you have to compromise quality when you look for diversity. I reject that wholeheartedly. There's no such thing. You can find both, and I think they're all over the country. And quite frankly, you're raising a lot right here in the community yourself. Area 4 came up because the chief brought it to the attention of the task force, which shows you the value of the task force or the value of a process to do that. And it was a series of recommendations, and as Jim alluded, or I think maybe it was Reynard alluded, is first this issue of all you have to do is turn on the TV, pick up social media, look at YouTube videos, and you can see all the engagements and all the negative interactions between police over the country, all over the country, and youth. 14-year-old girls being body slammed and punched in the ribs, kids being stopped. I think I saw an 8-year-old boy being stopped and handcuffed, kids being threatened. And these are a handful of incidences, but they highlight a significant challenge. That's why the training component and understanding policing a teen brain, understanding what trauma can cause it. That's why you have to work on the role of the police, if any role, within the schools. That's why the policy is important. And so as we're facing this challenge, this is one of the unique departments that actually has a policy. And a lot of departments are still not at the point where they have a policy on youth that would mandate things like parental notification, supervisory response. These are good things, but all these policies are starting points. And so they should evolve. They will learn more. We'll learn more about it. We're learning more about youth interaction and its impact every day, because it's not just anecdotal. I think there's a lot of you experts in here. This is a science, and the impact that the police can have in that interaction with the youth can scar or can raise this kid up for many years to come. So I wanted just to link those in because it's important. And what we also did at 21CP, so the task force did this work, and they did it in a very structured way that I think allowed for you to weigh in at each step along the way. But we also took a look at it outside the task force from my firm's perspective, and that was the 4 of us, the 5 of us with Jim, and 6 with Colleen, to take a look at the department's efforts in implementing the recommendations from President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. And why this was important to us is, one is if you look at when the task force was put together, was following the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014. And the series following up, I think immediately following that was Eric Gardner in New York, then it was Philando Castile. There was a series of high-profile shootings and killings of unarmed black men, to be very candid. So the president put together this task force, and he gave us the mandate to take a look at recommendations that will do 2 things, and this is why this is important for the evaluation. Calm down tensions and improve relationships between the police and the community, and at the same time make sure those efforts are not a hindrance to crime fighting, and that we're still engaging in effective public safety so that the gains over the last couple decades, where we're at some of our historic lows in crime and violence, will not go away. So there were a series of recommendations that the task force put together. They had listening sessions around the country. Jim, when I was the director of the task force and the director of the COPS office, we brought Jim in to facilitate that. We heard from hundreds of experts from around the country, community leaders, Black Lives Matter experts, activists, attorneys, cops, unions, everything we could think of to come up with a series of practices. So we wanted to take a look at the department to see where the department was at. In the final report, you'll get a chart that will have recommendation by recommendation, what GRPD is doing, and if they're not doing it, what recommendations we may have if they are doing it. Now, a lot of the recommendations don't apply to local law enforcement, but many do. For purposes today, let me just give you an overall assessment of what we found. First off, I applaud the chief. I met your chief before getting a contract with the city of Grand Rapids at the White House in D.C., because after we did the task force report, the president did one of the series of briefings for law enforcement to talk about, to put it out there, to make sure this doesn't become a report, hint, hint, that just disappears and sits on somebody's desk and gathers dust, that people actually do something with it, which I'm sure you're going to do with these recommendations here. And so we did a series of briefings. I want to say maybe over about 2 or 3 months, we brought in over 500 law enforcement leaders that were invited, that responded. But this is out of 16,000 police departments. So we scratched the surface. But your chief was one of the 500 that showed up. So I had an opportunity to meet him then. And then look at the commitment that the city of Grand Rapids had in looking at 21st century policing. A lot of the efforts that they started then, whether it's implicit training, procedural justice, what we found is looking at the department, it'd be fair to analyze it as this. You have a pretty solid department, a very good department. It is well trained. It has strong policies. It is nationally accredited. It has the makings of a great department. The area that we found the biggest deficiencies, and we're being very candid about it. So we should give them applause for being a very professional, top of the line in the top percentage of the company. In the country, only 4% are accredited. So that's a good thing. These are good steps. The effort so far at 21st Century Policing is a good step. Pillar 2 and Pillar 4 in the task force is where we found some deficiencies. Pillar 2 is policy and oversight. Policies, they got de-escalation, use of force. Oversight, we believe, and you see a recommendation that the city should really start thinking and starting a process, a collaborative process of identifying what form of civilian and community oversight is necessary for the full engagement and the empowerment of the community in Grand Rapids. Don't cut and paste from other places in Seattle and Oakland. You got to figure out what works here. And that's a process that requires all of you to weigh in, to think about it, what level of oversight, what kind of engagement, what kind of voice should you have. So that's one of the main recommendations we're making to the cities, that you have that process to identify community engagement and oversight. The other area that we saw room for improvement, not deficiencies, because they're making good effort, but much room for improvement, is community policing and crime reduction. Well, in crime reduction, the city's already started facing that when you're starting to, I can't think of the name of the company, and I apologize, Mayor, the group, but looking at violence through the public health lens, looking at evidence-based practices on how to fight crime so that your strategies to reduce crime don't have the collateral damage of disparate stops, over-enforcement, over-policing of communities of color. So when you start engaging those evidence-based practices, that's the kind of return on investment you have, and you've already started that process, which is outstanding. The community policing part we're really pushing is that we have to go now from community engagement, community meetings, and community programs. It's nice to play with the kids, and we can have all kinds of events, but that's not necessarily community partnership. Community partnership means that not only do you have a seat at the table, but you're a part owner of the table itself. That's the part with the strongest recommendations we're pushing for. That also goes with the task force recommendations under categories, well, in the first one with the staffing deployment and 4, so that you have the kind of relationship to make sure that the community is empowered to respond to that assessment. So here's our recommendation that we provided. And we believe if this occurs, this will add to the 38 recommendations. 1, it is important that the department, the city, and the community implement those 38 recommendations. Collectively, when they're put together and you do that, we strongly believe, from our point of view of working in this industry for a collective, and I'm going to age all of us in 21CP, a collective 300 years or so of experience and working all over the country, that those core recommendations, they're not panacea responses, they're not the answer to everything, but they will start a process, a staffing analysis and deployment, looking at community policings, citywide adoption, partnerships. That implementation must occur. The second part would be, as a part of that, and I want everybody to take a listen to this, and I think this is important. What has not happened yet from our perspective in Grand Rapids is, when starting the community policing process, we still have not reconciled our past and some of the things that are going on today. What we are recommending, if you look at the first bullet, is that we need to start a racial reconciliation process. The first part of their process is the acknowledgement of the role that police have played historically and continue to play in this country, in this community, in communities of color. People don't want to hear it. Cops get mad when I say it, but these are facts. These are not opinions. We've played a role that have been significant in the history of this country. So the acknowledgement that police have played that role, therefore some of the trust is generational mistrust that is validated by every time a video comes out or an incident comes out. Then I think once we acknowledge that, we can then move forward, because as Nelson Mandela has said, is only the truth can put the past to rest. So this has to start with truth. The good thing is, when we had a meeting, we heard nothing but truth and engagement, and the police department wants the same thing you want, so I don't think this is going to be a problem, but it's just the acknowledgement that there was a time in which if you had to kick someone off the bus, it wasn't a driver that did it, it was the police that did it. And those were actions that they were designed to do, or to disrupt the exercising of First Amendment rights. So this is a historical way so that many of the community understand that it is kind of validating why you have so many concerns and why they continue today. That generational mistrust is significant. The second part would be the full implementation. You have not finished the implementation of the Lambert study, and there's a series of recommendations with regards to certain data collections. The task force got into it as far as adding that data to the early intervention system, to take a look at, and here's the thing, you heard a couple things with data collection and assessments. Let me clarify something. We really don't want you to go through paralysis through overanalysis, right? Where all you do is study, okay? At some point, you gotta take the test. Okay, it's test time now. And so now it's time for execution. So some of the analysis we're talking about is processes within the department where it's collecting its own data, where it's evaluating its data, and making managerial decisions on a daily basis based on the response of that data. So if you're going to have training, then you should be able to base that training on a training needs assessment. Not just think of what's a good class. Take a look at your complaints. Take a look at your uses of force. Take a look at the feedback from the community and develop training to the responses that people are concerned with. That's how you respond. So this is why this assessment is very important. And so we just believe that that's the other part. You have to finish that study, or at least the recommendations. The next one is that we believe greater community involvement in policy development, training, both design and delivery, and an oversight. What that means is we heard from the state, I think I shared this with you back some months ago, that the state training directors, and I think Jim told us, even at the international, that long acronym, I can't even pronounce it, all the training post directors in the country, that this specific department, the Grand Rapids Police Department, is recognized as having extremely high quality training. In fact, we told them today in a pre-meeting with the task force, we're going to be pointing a lot of departments your guys' way on how to engage, because you're doing it the right way. The department is a very good department, extremely good men and women that want to do a tough job, taking on challenges that are the same challenges in where I'm from in Oakland and Hayward and all over the country. I just left Chicago this morning based on doing a consent decree work with the Attorney General of that state. So there's a lot of challenges. The only thing that's very unique about Grand Rapids is how you're responding. And so a lot of cities are going to learn from that. But you have to still have community involvement in the training. So, imagine a day where if you're going to talk about dealing with people in mental crisis, then it'd probably be nice to hear from somebody who actually suffers from a mental disorder directly, to understand what he or she is going through and understand the challenges, understanding what it means, along with the experts in the field that have the science behind it, so that when an officer is engaging, to the extent he or she does not compromise their safety, that they may pause a moment and realize that that reaction or non-reaction, that yelling or not listening, may not be complete resistance. It may not be obstruction. It could be that the person is in crisis. And when they're in crisis, everybody knows here, yelling and putting hands on them is probably the last thing you want to do. So this is why this is important to get the community involved in the training. The other part is that the GRPD should do a collaborative process we talked about with the community oversight. The idea is that you should have a voice in all aspects of police operations. So whatever model you develop should give you voice into that. There's technical aspects of the field. There's even a few places in the field in which officer safety would demand that it be not public. But I would say the other 99% is absolutely engaging the public. And so I kudos to the department for putting its policies online. One of the next recommendations that we asked, and I know the chief's already started this process, become part of the open data initiative, where all the data comes in there, use of force and stop data, and not just a report. A report is great, but as a former chief, I'm going to be very candid, I'm going to give the report my spin on it, which means the department is great, I'm great, this is my spin, right? You want raw data, so you can then manipulate the data, look at it so that you can come back and say either you're great or you're full of it. But it's your data to take a look at. So publishing open data is very important. The chief should continue to put out the reports because that's transparency. So publishing the policies, a kudos to the department for doing that. Publishing more information. I think the task force recommendations and process along the way has been on the city's website. So once again, very positive steps towards that. This is just saying, please keep going in that direction. And then this one we had to put up again, is two last ones, is that the GRPD provide continual updates on this process. When I was in DC, there's a theme that if you want something to disappear and you want people to forget about it, create a task force, write a report on it, and then send it out. And that will be the fastest way to kill something. What the president did with his task force, what the mayor and the commission did with this task force, is by we engaged the field so that the recommendations came from them. So it wasn't a group of just 11 people that thought they were smarter than every other body in the community and disappeared and came back. Same thing with this task force. They were smart enough to say, no, we're not going to just have a bunch of experts, so-called experts and consultants come in and do it. In fact, we're going to have community members, and we're going to respect that there's an expertise with law enforcement and rank and file. So these are their recommendations, because of your involvement, these are your recommendations. So collectively, these are our recommendations. So now for this to have meaning, they have to become alive. They have to be operationalized. And so there should be a periodic and regular update of where this is at. And I think you'll hear from the city manager later about how that process can look and the benefit of it. And then the last one from the assessment is the full adoption of community policing. I think this is probably the key recommendation. I apologize if it sounds a little fluffy and all that, but to me, community policing is not just the engagement with the youth or the kids. It's the operational philosophy on how you hire, why you hire somebody, how you train them, what kind of work you got them doing, how you fight crime, how you hold people accountable, the role that the community plays in every single aspect of the department, the relationships, the partnerships, the family building, the community building. All of that is community policing. When a murder suspect gets arrested, that's community policing. When a kid gets diverted, that's community policing. When the department is the community says we have a problem with the department and they listen and fix it, that's community policing. It can't just be that for Saturdays we got a 2-hour period where we get to play a couple of ball games and stuff like that, because you can't play ball with me at 2 o'clock and then stop me at 6 o'clock and think something's okay. They have to coincide, they have to come together. So we believe in final that you have, if I could say this, Chief, I applaud you. It was an honor to work with this task force. It was a true honor to work with the men and women in the community, and especially the police department. You have a very good department, and I've seen a lot. Like I said, I've seen a lot. I left a courthouse today because we're negotiating a consent decree between the State Attorney General of Illinois and the Chicago Police Department, who is now, to their credit, has negotiated. We're hoping that this court order is entered, and over the next 5 or 10 years, we'll have court order reforms. And interestingly, as I told the group today, the things that people want in Chicago is going to sound very familiar. Community voice, community input, involvement, accountability, community policing. You guys are doing it, and you're doing it at a stage where you get to control it, not at a stage where it can no longer be done unless someone forces them to do it, orders them to do it, or beats them down to do it, or has a court order. And in some cases, that's what exactly is needed. And in Chicago, unfortunately, it is needed. It's not going to happen without that court order. For you, it can happen because you have a roadmap, you have the commitment, you have a strong community, you have activism, you have a great department that is trying to do a good job. But I think you also have the department that I hope now seeing that there's room for significant improvement, and that this is one of those perpetual goals that don't disappear simply when you implement the 38 recommendations. That some of the recommendations are designed that it will be ongoing so that there's a relationship building. So on behalf of 21CP, Jim and the other principals who cannot be here, it's been a true honor to be involved with you. And as I told the mayor, I told the city manager and the team, as we go around the country, we are definitely pointing to you on a process point of view of how to engage. And even tonight, look at this. You got 100+ people here tonight that could be doing so many other things, the mayor said, but you're engaged here because you want to see the department move forward so that the community can move forward. So you definitely have our applause and respect. And thank you guys very much. I look forward to watching you to see what you do next. Thank you guys.
Well, you're going to have an opportunity for some feedback and input in regards to the recommendations. Jim's going to come and explain how that process is going to work. So come on forward, please, Jim. And as he works his way up, if you don't have a task force member at your table, it may be a good idea to maybe find another table. If you folks, task force folks, raise your hands, please, real quick, just so folks know where you are. So if you're at a table that doesn't have a hand raised, maybe relocate to a separate table. And with one of those hands raised, you can ensure that your voice is heard.
And this process is not that complicated. If you wind up not having a task force member at your table, you should be able to do this. I learned, I've been working with Ron for a number of years, and I can honestly say I'm not too sure I know anybody smarter on policing than Ron Davis, but I also know that he can eat up a clock. And so if we are, I'm going to primarily, and to the facilitators, if I could have your attention, I'm going to primarily focus on the top 5 recommendations, and then I really want to go around the room and get report out, so that'll be the major question given the time that we have left. It's quite simply moving around the table, identifying a recommendation that you think is most important. The facilitator is going to capture those. We're going to ask the table to come to some kind of consensus as to what the 5 recommendations should be, that first 5 that should be implemented, and then we're going to ask for report outs, and then we'll collect these forms at the end. So we're going to give you about 15 minutes to do that. If you've read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, where he talks about the capacity to make rapid decisions, we can do this. So let's do it in 15 minutes, okay?
If I can have everyone's attention, I have a very important announcement. This is the last call. If you want any food, you better get up there now. Thank you.
take a couple of more minutes on your top 5 recommendations, and then we'll have a report out. Okay, my friends, if I could have your attention for 1 second. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask, we're going to go down very fast. I'm going to ask each table to read their first 2 recommendations, or we'll be here for breakfast. I'm going to ask you to do just the first 2 recommendations, and let's start. I guess we're starting with Maria. Okay, if we could give Maria your attention.
Hello, everyone. So I'm not going to go with the first 2, but I'm going to pick 2.
Okay.
Number 1 is, and obviously we've been talking about engaging police and whatnot. So 1 is that police should engage if there's a stop, and I guess with everybody, that if they're littering or jaywalking and whatnot, that it turn into an educational versus an arrest or a ticket. And then the other one is that we're talking about hiring or deployment and hiring, but we're not really talking about, and the officers, our police department working with less, but we're not really talking about actually hiring more officers or the city giving more money to hire more officers.
Okay. Captain? Let's take the top 2, if you would.
Overwhelmingly, it was youth policy.
Okay.
And the work in progress, and doing a lot of explanation on that and how we got to here. And I'm looking through, we got through 2, and we kind of got a mixed bag. We got to 2, but I see that training and also complaints outside of normal business hours were something that
Okay.
people were pretty good there.
Good.
Agree?
Very good. John?
We were much the same. Our first and number 1 priority was the youth policy, taking a closer look at that and looking at some of the other recommendations by the task force. And then secondly, we have recruiting and hiring with looking at working towards a more diverse patrol population.
Okay. Colleen, go to Jeff over here. The 2.
We had a fairly diverse set of the recommendations throughout the group, but kind of the 2 areas that really stood out were the community policing initiatives and recommendations, as well as the youth policy recommendations, almost in their entirety. So those are the 2 main areas that our group was kind of focused on, with a lot of discussion about the different recommendations under number 1 as well, which is the staffing and deployment.
Okay. Was there another group on this line here?
Okay, so let me do
Okay. Good. Top 2.
Yes, the top 2. The top 2 is training for the police in reference to racial equity and undoing racism. And also our second recommendation is to see an ongoing accountability with the police, this process under the city racial equity plan. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else over here? Okay. Then let's go back over here.
All Our top two recommendations also surrounded the youth policy with specific emphasis, on 4.2 and 4.5 with cohesive training, effective training, mental health training in regards to youth. And then the second recommendation was recruitment and hiring, how we do that in hiring more minorities and people of color.
Okay. You, Martin?
So we actually got through all five. Actually, I'll kind of just briefly talk about it. So anyway, we had 4.5 and 4.2 with the obviously with the youth interaction policy, very important. Also, we talked about recommendation 5.1 under community policing, just recognizing that community policing works best when it's supported by elected leaders and is a subset of community-based government. We thought that that was very important. Also, 6.1, the city and GRPD continuous recruitment outreach efforts with specific focus on minority recruitment and retention. And then also 1.2 was something that we had a lot of discussion on, and that briefly was just talking about the GRPD should develop policies that provide clear guidance to officers regarding their expected duties and responsibilities when deployed in the community. So a very learned group, and we had some great discussion. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Let's keep it to top two. I like him, so I gave him 5. He's a really nice guy, very smart. So, then there's Dan. Go ahead. Sorry, Dan. I'm sorry, Dan. It was just too easy. Go ahead, brother.
I got your wife right here. I'm going to stick with you. We focused on 5.2, community oversight and partnerships, and then we had some really great discussion that centered around 3.2 and 3.3, expanding cultural competency. And a term that came up that I really liked was that the department should adopt a multicultural intelligence training philosophy.
Good. All right. Let's go back here. Who's on that table? Good. Sergeant, introduce yourself.
I'm Sergeant Kathy Williams. I'm not part of the task force, but I'm going to be our representative from our table. So our top two recommendations are where we stressed most of our conversation was around recommendation number 5, which focuses on community policing and crime reduction. And then our second one was 1.1 with regard to the staffing and deployment process. Our group felt that many of these recommendations will be fulfilled when we have the staffing to do that.
Okay. Thank you. Marcus.
All right, we focused on data. Our group chose, due to a great statistical analysis by the judge, recommendation 1.6 in the Lamberth report. GRPD should expand its data collection in the following areas. We feel like that could open up the doors for looking at forward movement and indicators. And we also thought that 2.5 and 2.7 go together. GRPD should expand its early intervention system to include stop and search data.
Okay, good. Ed, your table.
Our group was pretty general. We didn't really pick on any one or 5.1 or 5.2, but specifically community policing is obviously the high point, stressing the cultural differences that has been mentioned, and then creating personal relationships with as many people as you can in the community so they know a kid or kids and they won't make a mistake of not knowing what they're all about or some of their background or even the mental health issues came up. And then the second thing was the training. And that kind of wraps around the whole idea of community policing, training the cultural competencies and some of this bias business and focusing on that a lot. So they're pretty interested in the training aspects of all of this stuff. So.
Okay, good. Andrew?
We had a lot of good discussion over here. 3.2 and 3.3 under training, felt that cultural training helped us better understand different communities was very necessary. Community policing, the group felt was necessary to get into the neighborhoods, get to know people, first name basis, have them get to know us and develop a better partnership. because only together can we fix problems and improve things. And also, we'd like to see the youth policy, to move forward and maybe make some tweaks with it.
Okay, very good. Any other table? Right here? Top two.
Top two, obviously the youth policy, but more importantly, agreeing with the brother, human rights brother, undoing the racism, to say sorry. Because we all, black people here, know stories of the 60s and 70s of all the bad cops and beating black people's butts. So there needs to be an apology.
Okay. Any table we miss? Okay, this really closes out the work on the 38. What we're going to, task force members, if you be sure to collect those 5 recommendations, we are going to type those up and we'll give those to the chief and the city manager in this process. And this closes out the work on those 38 recommendations, but obviously there's other opportunities for input as we go forward. I'm going to ask the chief to come up and make a few comments. Dave, if you could come up.
Thanks, James. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to start by thanking everyone who's here tonight, because we can't get to where we want to be without your input. I also want to mention that this department and this community prides itself on continuously improving, and that's what this process is about. The 38 recommendations that you have in front of you, we've been working on as we've gotten them. This has been a working committee. So as we received recommendations, we've been working to implement them, and we look forward to getting with you in the near future to give you updates. So this is not the end of a process. This is not even a midpoint. This is a continual dialogue to give this community the police department that they deserve, which I think is the best in the state and one of the best of its size in the country. So that didn't happen by accident. It happened by what you see going on in this room, which is dialogue, difficult conversations, and I appreciate your part in it. So thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And the department has been really incredible in this process and transparent with the policies. Anything we asked for, they delivered and did the research and data collection. It was extremely helpful in the process. I'm going to turn it over to, did I miss a table? Now, if you had now because we're not relitigating the recommendations, if you have a comment or a suggestion about one of the recommendations, Ron Davis and Anita Hitchcock will be glad to talk to you about that and engage you in that conversation. Or you can send an email to one of them and we'll be sure to get your comments. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to your new city manager who's jumped right in the middle of this, and really applaud him for his courage. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank everyone again for coming, and again, I know tonight, on a night like tonight, shows the commitment from our community and our officers as well as our elected leaders for being here. And I want to thank our mayor and commissioners again for their support throughout this process. Again, my appreciation to all of the task force members. If they could please stand, and let's give them another round of applause for their work. Thank you so much. Again, for the partnership with 21CP and with James and Ron, your insights and expertise have become invaluable to us, and we are better as a community because of your sharing. I do want to also acknowledge one of the silent facilitators who often stands in the background but does not ask for much credit. One, I have to say this because one night I was on the share when I was getting sworn in, I was acknowledging all the trailblazers in the community, the first African-American mayor, and the first female mayor, Mayor Bliss, and the first African-American female commissioner, Commissioner Lanier, and I neglected to acknowledge our first African-American female city attorney, Anita Hitchcock. So I want to thank her for her work. as well as a trailblazer. Certainly appreciate Chief Rahinsky and the work that we will do together in improving our community. Let's give him a big hand. And again, all the women and men of the Grand Rapids Police Department for their tirelessly effort in serving our community. One of the things I believe that in order to improve any relationship, you have to be able to listen, whether that is a work relationship or a relationship with a significant other, marital relationship, and particularly with community relationships and community policing. We have to be able to listen to community, even if it's at times things we don't want to hear. And I believe that that's exactly what has been occurring in this community through nights like this, listening, whether it's been structured and planned events, or even like Sunday night, when at times it was listening out of the voice of frustration. And we have done a good job in listening. And how would I say that? It's not just based on my subjective opinion. We've listened to the 38 recommendations from the 21st Century Community Policing Study. We have listened to the report, the 12 recommendations from the Lambert Study. We've listened to the 25 recommendations from the SAFE Task Force Study. We've listened previously, when City Manager Assumption was here, to the 12-point plan. We will be listening again to the outcome of the deployment study that will be launched. I think we got about another 4 months before we get the results on that. We'll listen to the results of the Grand Valley state study that they're going to do on the police department and community relations. We're going to listen again to the perspective from Cure Violence. But after a certain point, you have to move beyond listening and begin acting. And so I think I've come to the city at a good time where lots of conversations have occurred, lots of studies have occurred, and we're at a critical point of now we have to begin responding to the various feedback and information that we've had. Otherwise, we're just having conversations. And so I am going to begin having a call, if you will, to acting on some of the studies with our commission. We're trying to firm up whether or not which meeting we will do it in November, whether it'll be the meeting on the 13th or 27th. But hopefully we can begin acting on many of these studies that we've been deploying. And particularly, I heard the prioritization conversation tonight, because we can't do everything all at once. And it was good we were having the table dialogue about prioritization. And I will be working with the chief about his perspectives based on the feedback that we've heard here tonight on prioritization. And I will tell you, one of the things that stands at the forefront, given the conversation I've heard time and time again at every table, I heard the themes of the youth deployment study, youth interaction study. I heard the themes of the deployment study. I've heard the theme of oversight and some of the other elements. They're all important. Now, I hope that when the chief and I get an opportunity to brief the commission on the 13th, that we will be able to begin to put in action some of those recommendations. We're not going to solve it overnight. As Ron said earlier, we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to fix it overnight, but we will be able to begin taking some important steps. And because some of these, if you're listening and you're being intentional about listening, requires some significant items for action. Some of this we're going to have to start budgeting for in our upcoming budget discussions. We're going to have to start planning for, and even we may have to start negotiating for in the upcoming contract negotiations. So we will begin being very deliberate about prioritizing our next steps. And I will, some of you even asked tonight about what if there's additional feedback that you wanted to have. My hope was that you have been providing feedback to the task force over these past 18 months. But if there is additional feedback, the chief's office, has made himself available. Your weekly meetings, office hours are when, Chief? This Friday, I open office hours from 10 to 2. And Asante will be joining me on the stage right after if there's anyone who wants to have additional conversations. But we will be announcing to the community when we'll have that opportunity to have the presentation to the commission. I know our commissioners will want to have an opportunity to talk about it among each other and with community, but hopefully we will be able to move forward as we begin planning our fiscal plan for FY20. Again, I want to thank you for coming tonight, and I do believe that all of these issues that we talked about are solvable. I believe it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't be here if you did not believe we were able, with our collective strength, to solve some of these issues. And this is what community policing is, where community and police come together to be problem-oriented to solve the issues that are facing the community. With that, Mayor, anything else? Any other commissioners? No? I think we're ready to go. Thank you for coming.
Task Force